On today's show,
if you know that the price of going to a protest is that law enforcement will track your identity, that they'll add you to a database, that they'll share that with immigration enforcement and Homeland Security officials, that is tremendously chilling.
It's fair to say that I am an educated person and I am not aware of the extent of the surveillance we are under and how these tools are being used.
Yeah, it's so opaque. That's one of the things that sets surveillance apart. It is the form of state action that is most harmful to the most number of people without being observed. We oftentimes don't know. And the only reason, for example, that we know that there were more than 5,000 geofence warrants in a year is because I led a coalition of groups that put pressure on Google to tell us.
Hello and welcome to Beyond the Box, the social justice podcast that goes beyond the headlines and typical stories. We ask challenging and incisive questions that help us get to a deeper and more nuanced understanding of important issues. I'm your host, Doug Lasdon, founder and executive director of the Urban Justice Center. Today, we're lucky to have Albert Cahn, the executive director of STOP, Surveillance, Technology, and Oversight Project. I know Albert because he spent 2 years in this UJC's Social Justice Accelerator developing STOP. He's a nice combination of smart, driven, and reasonable. He's also a graduate of the Harvard Law School and now serves as a fellow at the NYU Law School, the Yale Law School, the Kennedy School, and Howard University. Welcome, Albert.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to be back at UJC. And yes, that is a ridiculous assortment of fellowships.
But all well-deserved. Tell us your origin story. Why is it you do the work you do? And I just want to throw in that right now the world is open for fascinating work for people. It's not-for-profit, for-profit. And I like to ask people how they ended up in the direction they're in now.
I wasn't bitten by a radioactive surveillance camera or something like out of a comic book. I grew up in New York and I had a couple of different nerdy hobbies, one of which was protesting police injustice and going to marches and becoming an activist from a young age. And one of my hobbies was building computers. And I really, as someone who is both very focused on social justice, who is focused on technology, saw from an early age the potential that they had when they came in combination. The threat that surveillance posed in particular to civil society, to protest, to democracy. And I came of age during 9/11. I graduated from high school a few months after it. And in the immediate aftermath of the attack, when we saw things like the USA Patriot Act enacted, when I saw more and more police with more and more cameras showing up to every demonstration that I went to, I really felt this need to push back against that type of technology. And luckily, I had this meandering career that took me down to DC and then to law school and then to a short-lived career as a corporate lawyer, and then really recognized that that wasn't what I wanted to do with my life, that I always was going to be an activist first, and the law was going to be a vehicle for that. And so after I left corporate law, first I helped take the helm of a Muslim civil rights group here in New York, doing a lot of work just as then candidate Trump was getting the nomination, and had the opportunity to lead some amazing marches and do a lot of incredible activism. But I was also helping a lot of people who had SWAT teams at their front door because of the surveillance technology that's increasingly ubiquitous in our modern lives. And that's what led me to found STOP, to really commit myself to fighting each and every day against the growth of the state and local surveillance apparatus that is, in my view, incompatible with the sort of democracy I want to live in.
Great. I guess we could say that you came to working age at the time of the start of massive surveillance through computer technology. And we're lucky to have you doing it. You know, I want to start with the broader picture. There is a tension between effective law enforcement and civil liberties. You might say that if we didn't have civil liberties and we could be in everybody's house and in everybody's accounts, we might have effective law enforcement. but there has to be a balance. And where do you see that balance?
Well, that's the thing. I actually reject the premise that there is a balance, because when we look at the billions of dollars we're spending on these surveillance apparatuses, a lot of them come at a huge cost, not just in dollars and cents, but to our rights, to our autonomy. And we don't get much in return. Look at ShotSpotter. This is arrays of directional microphones put primarily in low-income and BIPOC majority communities. And it's meant to automatically detect when there's a gunshot. It sounds like this great public safety tool. Oh, we'll know instantly whenever someone fires a gun. The problem is, according to the Chicago Police Department's Inspector General, according to other cities around the country, ShotSpotter can be wrong up to 90% of the time. And so what you have is a system that we're paying a lot of money to tell us constantly about gunshots that never happened. So police are rushing to crime scenes that don't exist, looking for suspects who aren't there. And we've seen, in Chicago, Adam Toledo, a 12-year-old boy, killed by officers because allegedly a false lead because of that.
But there must be some technology that watches us all the time that works better but limits our civil liberties, such as cameras in the streets.
Well, cameras have been deployed for years as a way to prevent crime. We saw in the 1980s, you had London investing in the Ring of Steel as a way to prevent IRA terrorism. Later it was justified around other terrorist organizations and knife crime prevention. And what we see is that high-density CCTV camera installation doesn't do a lot to prevent crime. It can be of some value in investigating it, but we're oftentimes sold on the premise that if we spend billions of dollars on these camera systems, and we are truly talking about billions, that it will lead to a reduction in crime. And the evidence just isn't there to substantiate it.
Isn't prosecuting crime a worthwhile goal? That if we are better able to prosecute crimes, it seems logical to also deter crimes, but if not, prosecuting crimes might be enough of a motivation to have it.
Well, we have to differentiate punishing crime and preventing crime, right? Because
sure. I think I said law enforcement.
Yeah.
So, yes.
But if you're talking about, prosecuting crime as a worthwhile goal, we've seen from mass incarceration in the United States that high levels of prosecution isn't equivalent with high levels of deterrence. That mass incarceration has proven to be a fairly poor public safety strategy.
I'm certainly not arguing for putting more people in jail.
Yeah.
We're not here to discuss mass incarceration, but there are other tools besides incarceration that we can use if someone has committed a crime.
Except you can't divorce police surveillance from police violence and mass incarceration, because often, these systems wouldn't be so scary, so harmful, so invasive, so Orwellian, if not for the ways that they oftentimes were the predicate to other forms of policing. When I think about police using facial recognition, I think about my colleague Derek Ingram, who led a number of high-profile Black Lives Matter marches in 2020, and then police officers holding a facial recognition match came to his door, tried to shut down his entire block, used a SWAT team to try to arrest him, all for the crime of allegedly using a bullhorn and speaking in the direction of officers. These are the sorts of abuses that the surveillance technology makes possible. And so as long as we frame the debate and the discourse as being a question of utilitarian benefits versus philosophical harms, I think we've seen that the American people will sacrifice just about any right, just about any constitutional privilege in order to stay safe.
Yes, and I think that's where I started this, and that I agree with you that what I've called civil liberties is a little amorphous and harder for people to get behind than effective law enforcement. And that's one of the problems, but it still defines a difficult issue.
Yeah, but I think there are parts of this debate where you do have that trade-off. But I think when it comes to banning technologies like facial recognition, banning the proliferation of drones, banning the use of ShotSpotter, the sorts of things that I'm fighting every day to outlaw in New York City, that these are tools that aren't helpful for public safety are a waste of money and are invasive and ripe for abuse.
Let me work off of that. And I've heard you talk that about surveillance, over surveillance or bad surveillance, however you would put it, is bad for democracy, and that what you are doing is protecting democracy. Can you describe that, what you're talking about for us?
Yeah, autonomy, the ability to walk our streets unwatched is indispensable to freedom of association, the ability to come together for people to protest and activate as a political movement. If you know that the price of going to a protest is that law enforcement will track your identity, that they'll add you to a database, that they'll share that with immigration enforcement and Homeland Security officials, that is tremendously chilling. In New York City, we've had a consent decree for decades, a handshoe agreement, which restricted the ability of the NYPD to surveil protests because they had done it so invasively for so many years, starting in the 60s and 70s, that they were sued for essentially violating people's right to come together and protest using undercover officers and analog surveillance means. But the ways that these tools allow officers to track protests digitally is way more expansive and way more invasive.
Now this message. We're here with Michael Barish of Barish and McGarry, lawyers for the 9/11 community. So 21 years after 9/11, incredibly, most of the 500,000 people who were exposed to the deadly toxins still don't know they're entitled to free lifetime health care and compensation. Why do you think they haven't enrolled?
Two reasons. First, many non-responders tell me that they didn't realize that no matter their family history, nearly every cancer has been linked to the exposure to the World Trade Center toxins. Second, many of them feel guilty and they don't want to take from others who have died. Thankfully, you won't be taking money from anyone since the Victim Fund and the health program have been fully funded by Congress. Susan, millions of dollars remain unclaimed. It's so important that you register. 68 cancers have been linked to the toxins. Remember, 9/11 didn't end on 9/11.
Contact Barish and McGarry today at 911awards.com. That's 911awards with an S.com.
There's something today with all of the technology that when I go outside, I feel somebody's watching. I've just lost my privacy in the streets. And today, we no longer have the, if you will, the expectation of privacy in public places. And perhaps we haven't lost our need for privacy and our concern for privacy, but it may be a little more constrained and located in our homes, in our financial bank accounts.
Oh, we have no privacy in our financial stuff. Yeah, like all of that is routinely monitored by law enforcement unless you're using cash. And even then it can be problematic.
But what about outside? In other words, you're still trying to protect it, I see.
Oh,
but,
of course, because, we know what happens without these protections. We've seen Black Lives Matter protesters tracked using a geofence warrant. This is a way that law enforcement can send a warrant to Google that says, we want you to identify every single person in a geographic area. That can be an area as small as a room or as large as an entire, town. It can track thousands of people for hours or days or weeks at a time. And it can be used to really reconstruct who goes to a protest, who goes to a healthcare facility for abortions or for gender affirming care. It can reconstruct who's going to a church on Sunday or a mosque on Friday. And to me, that level of tracking is ripe for abuse. And we've already seen geofence warrants being targeted at protests.
Tracking strikes me as different, and tracking is subject to the Fourth Amendment?
Well, the Fourth Amendment jurisprudence on all of this is, to put it in technical Harvard-approved language, a raging dumpster fire. It is an incoherent mass of case law built on common law interpretation of rulings that relate to different technologies over time that really have failed to keep up. So, what we've seen in recent years is the Supreme Court starting to pay a bit more attention to this. You had the Riley decision, which first said that You have a constitutional right to keep the contents of your cell phone private. You need a warrant to get it. You then saw in Carpenter, the Supreme Court said that your cell site location data, the information that our cell phones constantly report to the phone companies, that could not be accessed without a warrant. But now with these novel geofence warrants, also...
Can you tell us what a geofence warrant is?
Yeah, so this is...
Figured if I don't know what it is that our audience would like to hear.
Yeah, so this is the court order I was mentioning where Google will provide all the information for everyone in a designated geographic area. It could be the room we're in right now. It could be everyone in all of Manhattan. What sets these warrants apart is that traditionally, the Fourth Amendment requires that a court have probable cause prior to issuing a warrant. That has to be supported by oath or affirmation. All the law students out there are nodding their heads along. What a geofence warrant says is that instead of getting information that says, hey, I know Doug has committed a crime, here's my probable cause that he's did something, instead it will say, I have probable cause that one person in the Urban Justice Center committed a crime. I don't know who. And so I want the data on every single person who's been in that office.
Is that legal?
These have been issued thousands of times in the U.S. We've saw more than 5,000 geofence warrants for the most recent year on record for just Google.
So I'm sorry, if there are 500 people going to a protest and the police say, we know one of them is an agent, an illegal agent for someone, we need to be able to track all 500 of those people and they can do it?
Not only can they do that, but that's routine policing in the United States right now. It doesn't have to be a serious crime. It could simply be that, oh, we know someone broke a window. Oh, we know someone committed vandalism with graffiti. When we look at the legal powers that police have to use these surveillance technologies, it's not a sliding scale where you can only use the most invasive technologies for the most serious offenses. We see people having facial recognition scans because they tagged a wall with FTP or something else that officers didn't like. We see retaliatory using of this technology against disfavored political groups, disfavored religious communities. And so really it's something where the scale of it is just truly staggering.
It's fair to say that I am an educated person and I am not aware of the extent of the surveillance we are under and how these tools are being used.
Yeah, it's so opaque. That's one of the things that sets surveillance apart. It is the form of state action that is most harmful to the most number of people without being observed. Like if someone is coming and physically searching you, physically stopping and frisking you, physically taking your belongings or going through your property, if they're taxing you or fining you, if they're doing anything else that a government can do, you know that it's happening. But when the government collects our data and uses it to track us in this way, we oftentimes don't know. And the only reason, for example, that we know that there were more than 5,000 geofence warrants in a year is because I led a coalition of groups that put pressure on Google to tell us, because the courts weren't telling us. No one was telling us. And now, years after they first started being used, we're starting to get a handful of courts that are actually making public decisions on this as part of motions to exclude in the criminal cases. And so they are starting to get struck down. But it's only years after the fact.
And that might be a natural process. You have a new technology, the police and others take unfair advantage of it. And as we learn, the law begins to catch up.
But that's also something that our partners and we are trying to push back on.
Sure.
So we have been pushing laws called CCOPS, Community Control of Police Surveillance. And the whole idea behind this law is that you should not be able in a democracy to have the police unilaterally decide that they're going to use a new policing surveillance tool without telling us. That if you want to use something, you have to go through a notice and comment process. You have to get public permission.
That is an interesting response to technology, that as we develop technology, now we have this problem of technology beating us to it. So we need a principle for new technology.
Exactly. It's not a technical phenomenon that we see this sort of police surveillance. It's purely a legal one, because the exact same surveillance tools are available for purchase in every country on the planet. right? But the reason why surveillance in New York is more like the level of surveillance we see in Shanghai than what we see in Stockholm, Sweden, is because Sweden has very strong, civil rights protections against the adoption of novel forms of mass surveillance. And that is the thing we're fighting for, the legal protections to block the consistent momentum to just track us more and more invasively.
That's terrific. It's good to learn this, and that's why we're doing the podcast. We appreciate having you.
I always recommend at this point in a conversation that people look at a lovely image of a kitten or a puppy or something to remind them there's still joy in the world. There's still happy things. Yes, it is bleak, but we continue to fight to make the world a better place.
And we're lucky to have you doing it. Hi, everyone. We're trying to get the word out about the podcast. So if you like it, please make sure to follow us on your favorite podcast app, and please rate us 5 stars on the Apple Podcast. And finally, please pass this episode on to your friends. Thank you for your support.
Now this message. We're here with Michael Barish of Barish & McGarry, lawyers for the 9/11 community. So 21 years after 9/11, incredibly, most of the 500,000 people who were exposed to the deadly toxins still don't know they're entitled to free lifetime health care and compensation.
Yes, it's frustrating that most non-responders still haven't taken advantage of the 2 programs that were created for them. Downtown office workers, residents, students, and teachers were breathing the same toxic dust. Not surprisingly, they're getting the same cancers and they're dying of the same illnesses.
More people have now died of 9/11 illnesses than the nearly 3,000 people who died on that day.
Sadly, that's true. So I urge everyone to protect yourselves. Register for the health program and the Victim Fund now, even if you're currently healthy. Protect yourselves. Protect your families.
Contact Barish & McGarry today at 911awards.com. That's 911awards with an S.com.
I've heard you talk about working with both Jim Jordan and AOC, and I'd love to hear what that is, because we need more topics to bring us all together, and maybe this is one of them.
Oh, just to be clear, I haven't worked with them personally. It's more that facial recognition is one of the few topics where they agree, where you see people on the left and the right who both strongly oppose the unfettered growth of facial recognition technology.
Do they do it for the same reasons? Oftentimes, the left and the right want the same result but have different motivations.
What I found is that people across the political spectrum, regardless of their party affiliation, regardless of their level of political activity, if you explain to them how the technology works, they are terrified of it being misused, but they're terrified of it being misused by different people. So if I talk about the NYPD misusing facial recognition, I tend to get a lot of support from progressive Democrats, a lot of support from more liberal folks, and much less concern from those on the right. But yet, if I talk about the exact same facial recognition software being used in the exact same way by federal tax officials, suddenly I have a lot of conservative officials who are and conservative activists who are quite concerned. And I wrote a piece of legislation that would help outlaw geofence warrants and a few similar abuses. It's pending in New York State. It got turned into a model bill in partnership with the ACLU. And I work with lawmakers out in Missouri who are very conservative, who I disagree with on a lot of issues, but we 100% agree that geofence warrants are undemocratic. And we may disagree about what the worst example of abuse is because of those ideological differences, but there's still this shared sense that it is wrong for any agency to be able to commandeer that much data about that many people that easily.
It's nice to see you working across the aisles. That's heartening. We have a little time left. Tell us about facial recognition, where we are with it, and what are some of the issues, and what should people know?
It's bad. It's creepy. It's being used all the time. No, I mean, the NYPD uses facial recognition more than 10,000 times a year, and we're currently litigating with them because they refuse to provide any information about their own records on how biased and error-prone
is the main problem that it's just inaccurate, is just not good enough?
Well, with facial recognition, it's so bad you can't pick a hierarchy of harms because when most commercially available facial recognition systems are biased. They're much more error prone for Black, Latinx, and Asian individuals, much more error prone for women and non-binary individuals, much more error prone for anyone other than a middle-aged white person, white man.
Is that because it's made by middle-aged white people, or is there something with the technology that it just doesn't work for some reason with people with more pigment in their skin?
No, a lot of this comes from training data selection. There are a lot of subjective decisions in how you train these systems, how you build them, and that has influenced the effectiveness. But then it gets even worse because what we see in New York City is a lot of pseudoscience. It gets paired with the algorithm. So with the NYPD, you usually don't have a crime scene image where someone is looking straight at the camera, holding very still, showing their full face. It's usually a blurry image from an angle. And, the facial recognition system can be quite powerful under some circumstances. But if your mouth is open, police have to Photoshop it closed. And if your eyes are closed, they have to Photoshop it open because unless they do that, the system oftentimes won't recognize that there's a face there. And even more than that, when only part of someone's face is visible, they'll go into Google Images. And in one case, they just Googled black male model, took a random model's jawline, copied and pasted it onto the image from the CCTV, and then ran that art project through the algorithm. And we have no data to show us how error-prone that is. It's all pseudoscience.
Is it possible at this point to have safeguards, or is it too early in the technology development?
The only safeguard's a ban. Because
at this point,
I think.
Can you imagine at one point that it being good enough so that it is usable with appropriate safeguards?
No, because I think, I don't think our legal system has shown that it's capable of actually having enduring safeguards that will protect the most vulnerable communities and most marginalized communities. I mean, after 9/11, the NYPD went to the courts and said, hey, we need to be able to surveil people more broadly. And the courts allowed it. They said this is an emergency. And for over a decade, we mapped out where every single Muslim individual lived, went to school, worked, had a business in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. It was called the Demographics Unit. It was a massive decade-plus push that flagrantly violated the Constitution and never led to a single credible lead, according to the NYPD's own analysis.
I think that's the point. I'm wondering, is it possible to put safeguards around how you use such massive data? But I guess if in all that time there was never anything good that came of it.
That's not my take. That's the NYPD's own admission. And what I think is really telling is that after 9/11, that's when you needed the courts to step up. That's when you needed the safeguards there. That's when we really needed that check and that balance. And that's when they were really missing in action. So for me, it's not about trusting the courts or, elected officials to put the guardrails on. It's really abolishing the tools that are most at risk of being abused. And with facial recognition, the day when it's even more sophisticated and even more accurate and is able to look at every person in a crowd of 100 or 1,000 and identify them accurately, to me, that's not a win. That's a
Big
threat.
Brother.
Yeah.
That's Big Brother.
Because, I don't want to think that, an officer with a cell phone across the street from a mosque can know every single person who's going to pray. I don't want to think about the Texas official who sets up shop outside a Planned Parenthood facility to track every person getting an abortion in New York who lives in Texas. I don't want to see the day when our movements are so readily tracked that, again, all the sort of rights we think of as being essential to an open society wither away.
Well, thank you very much, Albert Cahn. This has been very enlightening, and I've appreciated it. I think our audience will appreciate it. Albert is doing critical work. People might want to learn more about it. I'm sure you can go to STOP's website. You can donate. I encourage everybody to donate and support his work. There's so much out there for him to be doing, and if he can have more resources, the better.
And I would just say, yes, all the support would be amazing, stopspying.org, but also realize we're fighting every day, and more than that, we're winning a lot. And we see this growing national, global movement to push back, and that's only going to increase. And really, I don't want anyone to ever feel hopeless, because this isn't just a threat. This is a fight we can win.
That's great. Thank you for your help.
Thank you for having me.